Cole Marsh was not the kind of man people noticed. He did not have a loud voice or a big personality. He did not go to the colony social events or sit at the front table in the mess hall. He lived at the far edge of the Veritas 9 settlement where the dirt roads turned into narrow paths and the narrow paths disappeared into the crystal forest. His farm was small. His house was smaller. And most evenings he sat on his porch alone and watched the twin moons rise over the glowing trees without saying a word to anyone. That was the way he liked it. Veritas 9 was not a pretty planet if you were used to the core worlds. The soil was dark and heavy. The air had a faint metallic smell that newcomers noticed but old settlers stopped caring about after a while. The crystal trees at the edge of the forest glowed a soft blue at night, which was the one beautiful thing about the place, and Cole had looked at those trees so many times over the years that he barely saw them anymore. He grew grain. He repaired his own equipment. He traded at the colony market once a week. He cooked simple meals and ate them alone at a plain wooden table. He had not always lived this way. There had been a time when he had people to cook for. A family. A reason to make big meals and keep the lights on late. But that was before the colony ship accident 7 years ago, and Cole had spent all 7 of those years learning how to be a man who needed very little and asked for even less. He was good at it by now. The night it all started was a cold one. The kind of cold that came fast on Veritas 9 when the wind shifted from the mountainside. Cole had finished his dinner, washed his plate, and gone out to check that the barn doors were properly latched before the temperature dropped any further. It was a routine he had done hundreds of times. Walk out. Check the latch. Come back inside. Take maybe 3 minutes. He was reaching for the barn door handle when he heard it. A sound. Very small. Like something scraping against the back wall of the barn, low to the ground. Cole stopped moving. He stood still and listened. The sound came again. Quiet and weak. Almost nothing. He walked slowly around the side of the barn. The blue light from the crystal trees was just enough to see by, casting long pale shadows across the ground. Cole rounded the back corner and stopped. There were 2 of them pressed against the base of the wall. He did not know what he was looking at for the first few seconds. His brain tried to find something familiar to compare them to and could not quite manage it. They were small, smaller than he expected from something with scales. Their bodies were narrow and their wings were folded so tightly against their backs that they looked almost flat. For legs. Long thin tails. Heads that were too big for their bodies in the way that young things always are. Dragon children. Or something close enough to it that the word felt right. They were pressed together with the bigger one slightly in front of the smaller one, which told Cole everything he needed to know about which one was the older sibling. Both of them were staring at him. Neither of them ran. That was the part that hit him hardest. They were clearly terrified. He could see it in the tension of their small bodies and the way their claws were dug into the dirt. But they did not run. They were too weak to run. Too tired. Too hungry. Their scales should have been bright. Cole did not know much about this species, but he understood living things well enough to know that these scales were wrong. They were dull and gray at the edges when they should have been full of color. Their eyes were sunken. Their ribs were visible even through the scales if he looked carefully enough. These children had not eaten properly in a long time. Cole stood very still. He did not move toward them. He did not make any sudden sound. He just looked at them and they looked at him, and the cold wind moved between them all. His first thought was to call the colonial office. Report an unknown biological contact. That was the correct procedure and he knew it. There were rules about this kind of thing on frontier worlds. Unknown species. Possible contamination risks. Proper containment channels. He looked at the smaller one behind the bigger one. It was shaking. Not from fear. From cold and hunger both together. Cole turned around and walked back into his house. He did not call the colonial office. He went to his kitchen and looked at what he had. There was leftover grain porridge from his own dinner, still warm in the pot. There were some root vegetables he had not used. Some dried protein strips he kept for long work days. He thought about what a hungry young creature might be able to handle, and he put together a simple plate of soft food. Nothing too heavy, nothing too rich. The kind of thing you gave to something whose stomach had been empty too long. He carried it back outside. They were still there. They had not moved. The bigger one made a very small sound when it saw him coming back. Not quite a growl, not quite anything, and pressed the smaller one further back against the wall. Cole stopped a good distance away. He crouched down slowly so he was not standing over them. Then he set the plate on the ground and pushed it forward a little and sat back. He waited. For a long time nothing happened. The bigger one watched him with those sunken eyes. Cole did not move. He did not speak. He just stayed low and still and let them make the decision at their own speed. It was the smaller one who moved first. It pushed past the bigger one and crept forward on shaking legs toward the plate. The bigger one made that small sound again like a warning, but the smaller one was already eating. Desperate eating. The kind that had no manners or caution in it because the hunger was simply too big. The bigger one watched Cole for another moment. Then it moved forward too. Cole sat in the cold and watched them eat everything on the plate and then sniff around the edges of it looking for more. His chest hurt in a way he had not felt in a long time. Not a bad hurt. Just the kind that came from seeing something small and helpless finally get what it needed. When the plate was clean, the two of them looked at him again. Cole picked up the plate and stood slowly. He went back inside. He did not try to touch them or speak to them or do anything except leave them to whatever they decided to do next. When he looked out the window 10 minutes later, they were gone. He told himself that was the end of it. Strange things happened on frontier worlds. Wildlife came close to settlements when they were desperate. It did not mean anything. He would report it in the morning through the proper quiet channels and that would be that. But he washed the plate and then stood at his kitchen counter for a moment. Then he made a second pot of porridge and left it covered on the stove. Just in case. He went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the wind outside and thought about the way the smaller one had pushed past the bigger one to get to the food. The bigger one had been afraid of him. Still afraid when it started eating. But the hunger had been bigger than the fear. Cole understood that. He understood it in a way that had nothing to do with species or science. He just understood it. He fell asleep without meaning to. In the morning, the second pot of porridge was untouched. The barn was quiet. The ground behind the back wall showed 2 sets of small claw marks in the dirt and nothing else. Cole stood in the cold morning air and looked at those marks for a while. Then he went inside and started his day like normal. He checked his equipment. He worked his field. He ate a plain lunch alone at his plain wooden table. That evening when the twin moons started to rise, he went to the kitchen without thinking too hard about it and cooked a little extra. He told himself it was just habit. He kept the barn light on anyway. They came back the next night. Cole was sitting on his porch when he heard the familiar sound of small claws on the dirt path behind the barn. He did not get up right away. He just tilted his head and listened and let the smallest corner of something warm settle in his chest. Then he stood up, went to the kitchen, and carried the food around to the back of the barn the same way he had the night before. Low and slow. No sudden movements. Plate on the ground. Step back and wait. They ate everything again. The night after that they came back again. And the night after that. And the night after that. By the end of the first week it had become a routine as natural as checking the barn latch or watching the moons rise. Cole cooked a little extra every evening. He carried it out at the same time each night. He sat at the same distance and waited while they ate. They stopped pressing themselves against the wall when they saw him coming. That was the first small change. They still watched him carefully, but the desperate flattening against the barn wall disappeared and that felt like something. On the 8th night they brought a third one with them. This one was smaller than the other two and lighter in color. Where the bigger one had dark reddish scales and the medium one had scales the color of cold ash, this new one was pale with a faint orange tint that caught the blue light of the crystal trees in a way that made it look like a very small flame. Cole looked at the 3 of them lined up in front of the plate and something about it made him quietly decide they needed names. Not real names. Just something for his own head so he could keep track of them and think about them without saying things like the big one and the medium one and the new small one. The dark red one he called Ember. The ash gray one he called Soot. The pale orange one he called Flicker. He did not say the names out loud. They were just for him. A private thing. But from that night on he thought of them as Ember, Soot, and Flicker, and it made them feel a little more real to him in a way that was hard to explain. Flicker was the most cautious of the 3. Where Ember would move forward without much hesitation and Soot followed close behind, Flicker always hung back at the edge of the light and watched everything with wide careful eyes before deciding it was safe to approach the food. Cole respected that. He made sure to move even more slowly on the nights Flicker seemed nervous, and he always made sure there was enough food left by the time the small pale one finally came forward. It was during the 2nd week that Cole noticed something was wrong with Soot. It was small at first. Just the way Soot moved when turning to the left. A slight stiffness. A barely visible hesitation before putting weight on the back left leg. Cole had spent enough years on a farm watching animals to know the difference between a creature that was just tired and a creature that was carrying pain and trying not to show it. Soot was doing the second thing. He started watching more carefully each night. By the 3rd night of watching he was sure. There was an injury somewhere on Soot's left side, low near the base of the wing where the wing connected to the body. The scales there were slightly raised and darker than the rest. Soot never touched that side against anything and never lay down on that side when resting. The injury was not fresh, but it was also not healing on its own. It needed attention. The problem was getting close enough to do anything about it. Cole thought about it for a full day while he worked his field. He could not rush it. If he moved too fast or reached out without warning, he would lose all the trust he had built and the children would stop coming back. He had to let them set the pace. He had to be patient in the way that required swallowing your own urgency and just waiting. He started sitting a little closer each night. Not much. Just a few inches. Slow enough that they adjusted without noticing. He also started putting a second smaller plate closer to where he sat so that to get to it they had to come nearer to him than they normally would. Ember figured out the second plate on the second night and walked right up to it without much concern. That did not surprise Cole. Ember was the brave one. So it took 4 nights to try the closer plate. On the night Soot finally came close enough, Cole stayed completely still until Soot had finished eating and was turning to leave. Then very slowly he reached into his jacket pocket and held out a piece of the soft dried protein in his open palm. Not pushing it forward. Just holding it there. Offering. Soot stopped. Looked at his hand. Looked at his face. Stood frozen for a long moment. Then very carefully Soot leaned forward and took the food from his palm. Cole exhaled slowly and did not move. The next night he did the same thing, but this time when Soot leaned in he moved his other hand with the slowest possible motion and just barely rested 2 fingers against the scales on Soot's back. Not grabbing. Not holding. Just touching. Letting Soot feel that his hands were not dangerous. Soot went stiff for a moment. Then relaxed and kept eating. Cole moved his fingers gently toward the injured area. When he got close enough to feel it properly he understood what he was dealing with. There was a deep cut under the scales that had partially closed on the outside but was still infected underneath. Warm to the touch. Swollen in a way that meant it had been there for a while and had been getting slowly worse. He went to his medical kit that night and thought carefully about what would be safe to use. He was not a doctor and he did not know this species. He picked the most basic gentle antiseptic he had and diluted it further just to be safe. He also found some soft clean cloth and a small amount of the plain sealing gel he used for his own cuts when working with sharp equipment. It took 3 nights of patient work. Each night Soot came to the closer plate and ate from Cole's hand and allowed him to clean and treat the wound. It was not comfortable. Cole could feel Soot tense up each time he touched the injured area. But Soot never pulled away. Never snapped at him. Just held still and endured it with a kind of quiet dignity that Cole found remarkable in something so young. On the 4th night Soot walked up to him without waiting for the food plate at all. Just came straight to him and stood there. Cole checked the wound. The swelling was almost completely gone. The skin underneath was closing cleanly. He applied the last small amount of sealing gel and sat back. Soot looked at him for a long moment. Then walked back to the food plate and ate dinner like nothing had happened. Cole smiled at the ground. It was about a week after that when Ember did something unexpected. The 3 of them had finished eating and Cole was sitting in his usual spot watching Flicker investigate the empty plate with great seriousness when Ember walked toward him directly. Not to the food. Not to the closer plate. Straight toward him with a purpose that was different from anything Cole had seen before. Ember stopped at his feet and opened one small claw. Something dropped onto the dirt in front of him. Cole leaned forward and looked at it. It was small and metallic and shaped in a way that was clearly not natural. A crest of some kind. Intricately made with patterns that curved and crossed each other in a way that looked old and deliberate and important. It was not something a child found in a forest. It was something that belonged to someone. Something carried carefully and given on purpose. Cole picked it up carefully. He turned it over in his hands. The metalwork was unlike anything he had seen in any colonial catalog or trade listing. He had no idea what it meant. That night after the children left he went to his small desk and photographed the crest with his handheld scanner. He uploaded the image to the Colonial Archive system and ran a search. The loading bar moved halfway across the screen. Then the screen went black. Then the system restarted on its own. One word appeared in plain text before the interface loaded back to normal. Restricted. Cole sat back in his chair and looked at the word for a long time. Then he looked at the crest in his hand. Then he put it carefully in the small lockbox under his desk where he kept his most important documents and went to bed. He did not sleep very well that night. The weeks that followed were the quietest and strangest of Cole's life on Veritas 9. Quiet because nothing dramatic happened. No one came to his farm asking questions. No official showed up at his door. The Colonial Office sent a general notice about unusual biological signatures detected near the southern farms and advised settlers to report any contact with unknown wildlife. Cole read the notice at his kitchen table, folded it carefully and put it in the recycling bin. Strange because of what was happening right in front of him every single night. Ember, Soot, and Flicker were changing. It was not sudden. It happened the way most real things happen. slowly and steadily and in small steps that you only noticed when you looked back at where things had started. The dull gray edges on their scales were gone now. Ember's scales had deepened into a rich dark red that caught the light of the crystal trees and threw it back like polished stone. Soot's ash gray had taken on a silver quality that shifted color slightly depending on the angle. Flicker's pale orange had brightened into something close to gold at the tips. They were eating well and it showed in every part of them. Their eyes were clear. Their movements were quick and easy. The hollow, tired look they had carried when Cole first found them behind the barn was completely gone. He found himself looking forward to the evenings in a way he had not looked forward to anything in a long time. He started varying the food. He had been giving them simple grain porridge and protein strips because those were safe and easy and he knew they could handle it. But now that they were stronger he started experimenting. Soft cooked root vegetables. Dried fruit from the colony market. A kind of thick grain cake he made himself that he thought might appeal to something with their body size. He watched carefully to see what they ate with enthusiasm and what they left, and he adjusted accordingly. Flicker, it turned out, was obsessed with the dried fruit. Would pick every piece of it out of anything else Cole mixed it into and eat those first with great concentration before considering the rest of the meal. Cole started keeping a separate small portion of dried fruit on the side just for Flicker. Ember ate everything equally and fast and without opinion. Soot was the thoughtful one. Soot would sniff things carefully before eating. Would sometimes take a single bite and then pause and seem to consider it before deciding to continue. Cole found this deeply entertaining and started putting small new things on Soot's plate just to watch the reaction. The trust between them had grown into something that felt real and solid now. Ember would sometimes come and sit near Cole while he was still eating his own dinner on the porch, not begging for food, just sitting nearby in the way that meant company was the point. Flicker had started doing something that Cole thought of as checking on him, walking around his legs in a slow circle when he first came outside each evening, looking him over carefully, then apparently deciding he was fine and going to the food. Soot still had the most dignity of the three and did not do anything as informal as sitting beside him or circling his legs, but would sometimes rest a chin briefly on his knee when he was sitting low to the ground, just for a moment, before moving away as if it had not happened. Cole did not make a big deal of any of it. He just let it be what it was. It was on a Tuesday evening, ordinary in every way, when Soot did something new. Cole had come around the back of the barn to set the food down and found all three of them already waiting, which was normal now. He set the plates down and stepped back and was about to settle into his usual sitting spot when Soot walked toward him. Not toward the food. Toward him. Carrying something. It was a piece of fruit from the crystal forest. Cole had seen this fruit before on his walks near the tree line. Round and pale blue with a soft outer skin. The settlers called them frost drops. They were edible for humans, though not particularly exciting in flavor. Cole had never bothered picking them. Soot set it very carefully on the ground directly in front of Cole's feet. Then stepped back and looked at him. Cole looked at the fruit. Then at Soot. Then back at the fruit. He understood what this was. He understood it in his chest before his brain had finished processing it. Soot had gone into the forest and found food and carried it back and brought it to him. The same way Cole had been bringing food to them every night for weeks. Soot was doing the same thing back. Cole picked up the frost drop. He took a bite. It tasted the way it always did, cool and faintly sweet and not very much else. He nodded at Soot with complete seriousness as if it was the finest thing he had ever eaten. Then he laughed. A real laugh. Not a polite sound or a quiet exhale, but an actual full laugh that came up from somewhere deep and surprised him with how good it felt. He sat down on the cold ground still laughing, and Flicker immediately came over to investigate what was happening, and Ember looked at both of them with the expression Cole had come to think of as mild superiority. He could not remember the last time he had laughed like that. Might have been years. He ate the whole frost drop sitting there on the dirt with three dragon children watching him, and felt something in his chest that had been tight for a very long time loosen just slightly. He thought about that laugh later that night while he was washing up. He thought about how a piece of ordinary forest fruit brought by a small gray dragon had done something that 7 years of quiet routine had not managed to do. He did not examine it too carefully. He just noted it and was grateful for it and went to bed. The following days passed in the same steady rhythm. Then on a Thursday morning the colony's emergency alert system activated. Cole heard it from his field. The alert tone was not something the colony used lightly. It was a deep repeating signal that came through every communication device on Veritas 9 simultaneously and meant that something serious enough to require immediate attention from every settler had occurred. In the 12 years Cole had lived on Veritas 9 he had heard it exactly twice. Once for a severe storm system and once for a reactor fault at the colony's power station. He stopped what he was doing and went inside and turned on his communication panel. The Colonial Defense Commander's voice came through flat and controlled in the way that people trained for emergencies spoke when they were working hard to stay calm. An unidentified vessel had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Veritas 9 system. It had not responded to standard hailing frequencies. It had not identified itself or its origin. It had not moved since arriving. It was simply sitting at the system's edge, and its size was— The commander paused very briefly before saying the next part, significant. Cole listened to the full announcement. Then he sat down at his kitchen table and stayed very still for a moment. He looked at the lockbox under his desk where the metallic crest was stored. He thought about the word restricted on the crashed archive screen. He thought about 3 children with dull scales hiding behind a barn in the cold. Children who had clearly been taught to stay completely invisible. Children who were alone on a frontier world with no explanation. Children who belonged to someone. The colony's communication channels were already flooding with settler chatter. Fear and speculation and questions that nobody had answers to yet. The defense forces were being mobilized. Ships were being repositioned. The colonial government was issuing statements that said a great deal of words while conveying very little actual information. Cole was still sitting at his table when his own communication panel made a different sound entirely. Not the broad emergency alert. Not a colonial government frequency. A direct transmission. Narrowband. Targeted. Sent specifically and precisely to the coordinates of his farm and nowhere else on the planet. He stared at the panel for a moment. Then he reached over and accepted the transmission. There was no voice. No image. Just a single line of text that appeared on the screen in a script he did not recognize. But below it, in plain standard human language, was an automatic translation. Said, "We know where our children are. We are coming. Do not be afraid." Cole read it twice. He looked out his window at the crystal forest where the blue trees glowed softly in the afternoon light. He heard a sound near the barn. He went outside. Ember, soot, and flicker were already there even though it was hours before their usual evening time. They were pressed close together and looking up at the sky. Cole walked over and stood near them and looked up too. The sky was empty and ordinary and blue. But the children were not afraid. He could see that clearly. They were not hiding or trembling or pressing against the wall the way they had on that first cold night. They were waiting. Cole put his hands in his jacket pockets and waited with them. The colonial soldiers arrived at Cole's farm before the shuttle did. 6 of them came down the dirt road in 2 vehicles with their weapons ready and their faces tight with the kind of focused anxiety that came from being asked to respond to something nobody had trained for. Their commander was a young woman named Sarah who had been head of Veritas 9's small defense unit for only 8 months and was clearly doing her best to look like she had everything under control. She did not have everything under control. She pulled Cole aside immediately and told him in a low, fast voice that the unidentified vessel had made contact with the colonial government approximately 40 minutes ago. It had identified itself. She stopped there and pressed her lips together like she was still processing the information herself. Cole waited. She said the ship belonged to the Virith Imperium. Cole nodded slowly like this meant something to him. It did not mean very much to him. He knew the name from the archive search that had crashed his system. He knew the word restricted. He did not know much beyond that. Sarah looked at him like she expected a bigger reaction. When she did not get one, she continued. The Virith Imperium, she said carefully, controlled approximately 1/3 of the known galaxy's eastern star systems. They had not made direct contact with any human frontier world in over 60 years. Their fleet was considered by every major galactic authority to be among the 3 most powerful in existence. The vessel currently sitting at the edge of their system was a flagship-class warship that was by itself larger than the entire colony of Veritas 9. Cole looked out at his field. He said that sounded significant. Sarah stared at him. Then she said that the ship had specifically requested permission to send a single shuttle to the coordinates of his farm, had used his name in the request, and the colonial government had agreed because when a flagship-class Virith warship asked for something politely, the colonial government of a small frontier world did not say no. Cole nodded. He asked if she wanted tea while they waited. Sarah did not want tea. The shuttle came down 40 minutes later. It came from the direction of the eastern mountains, dropping below the cloud line in complete silence. It was larger than Cole expected a shuttle to be, dark and smooth with a shape that suggested it was built more for authority than for speed. It moved over the crystal forest without disturbing a single tree and settled into Cole's field with a precision that flattened the grain in a perfect circle and then stopped. The colonial soldiers moved into a line without being told to. Weapons raised. Bodies tense. Sarah stood at the front with her hand resting on her sidearm and her jaw set hard. Ember, soot, and Flicker had come out from behind the barn when the shuttle appeared in the sky. They stood beside Cole now. Not hiding. Not pressing against anything. Standing in the open field in the afternoon light with their scales bright and their heads up and their eyes fixed on the shuttle door with an intensity that Cole had never seen in them before. He noticed that Flicker was trembling slightly. Not from fear. From something else entirely. Something that was the opposite of fear. The shuttle door opened. What came through it was not what Cole's brain had been quietly preparing for. He had been thinking in terms of something official. A diplomat. A representative. Someone sent to handle the situation on behalf of whoever was in charge. What came through the door was someone who was in charge. She was enormous. Taller than the shuttle door frame required her to duck slightly to clear. Her scales were deep black with a quality that was not quite black. More like the color of deep space where light bent around the edges of something massive. Her armor was dark and close-fitted and covered her chest and shoulders and forearms in plates that looked like they had been made specifically to not get in the way of anything she decided to do. She moved with the kind of complete physical authority that had nothing to do with effort. Like gravity worked slightly differently around her. Every colonial soldier dropped to one knee. Not because anyone ordered them to. Not because of training or protocol. They simply went down the way people go down when something in the ancient part of the brain recognizes that it is in the presence of something that has been at the top of the hierarchy for a very long time. Sarah went down with them, her hand coming away from her sidearm, her head bowing forward automatically. She did not look at the soldiers. She did not look at Cole. Her eyes found Ember first. Then Soot. Then Flicker. And everything about her that was armored and vast and authoritative did something that Cole could not quite name. It did not disappear. It was still all there. But something underneath it surfaced for just a moment. Something that was simply a mother who had been searching for a very long time and had not known until this exact second whether she would find what she was looking for. The three children ran to her. They did not make a sound. Cole had noticed from the very first night that they were almost completely silent and he had wondered about it many times. But they ran to her across the flattened grain with everything they had and she came down low to meet them and wrapped around all three of them at once and stayed completely still. Cole looked away. Felt like the right thing to do. He looked at his boots. He looked at the crystal trees at the edge of the field. He listened to the wind moving through the remaining grain and the distant sound of the colony settlement going about its afternoon and the faint hum of the shuttle cooling in the field. After a long moment he heard movement. He looked up. She was standing again. Fully upright. The armor and the authority all back in their proper places. But her eyes were on Cole now and they stayed on him as she walked toward him with a slow and measured pace that covered the distance between them in far fewer steps than it should have. She stopped in front of him. Cole was not a short man but the top of his head came to approximately her collarbone. He looked up at her and she looked down at him and the colonial soldiers were all still on one knee in his field and the three children were pressed against her sides and the twin moons of Veritas 9 were just beginning to show at the edge of the afternoon sky. She studied his face for a moment. His plain jacket. His worn work boots. The dirt on his hands from the field work he had been doing when the alert came through that morning. Then she spoke. Her voice was deep and resonant and the human language in her mouth was perfect in a way that suggested she had spoken it for a long time. She said, "You fed them. Every night." Cole looked at her. He looked at Ember and Soot and Flicker pressed against her sides with their bright scales and their clear eyes. He thought about the first night behind the barn. The shaking. The dull scales. The way they had been too weak to run. He thought about Soot's healed wound and Flicker's separate plate of dried fruit and the frost drop that had made him laugh for the first time in years. He shrugged. He said they were hungry. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said her name. Verithan Solkane. She did not say Empress. She said her name the way a person introduces themselves when they want you to understand that they are speaking to you as a person and not as a title. Cole said his name back. Cole Marsh. Just a farmer. She told him what had happened in the same plain direct way. Her ship had been ambushed by political enemies in the Sorvain corridor 3 systems away. The attack had been coordinated and fast and her ship had taken damage before it could respond properly. She had ordered an emergency jump. The escape pod carrying her children had malfunctioned during the jump and separated from the ship and landed on Veritas 9. She had spent the time since fighting her way back through hostile territory across 3 star systems with a damaged ship and incomplete crew. She had expected to find their bodies. She had prepared herself for that with the hard private thoroughness of someone who could not afford to fall apart but had made space for what falling apart would feel like once the mission was done. Instead she had found 3 healthy children with bright scales and healed wounds and a vocabulary of small human gestures they kept making at a farmer standing in a field. Cole said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Verithan looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Ember and Soot and Flicker. Then back at him. She lowered her head. All the way down. A full bow. Deep and deliberate and unhurried. Behind her every soldier of her honor guard who had come off the shuttle bowed at exactly the same moment. Cole stood in his field in his old work jacket with dirt on his hands and did not know what to do with any of it. So he looked at the 3 children and asked if everyone was hungry. Flicker immediately walked toward the house. That seemed to settle the matter. The colonial government sent 3 representatives to Cole's farm within the hour. They arrived in their best official coats looking slightly breathless and extremely nervous and stood at the edge of the field not quite sure how to proceed. Cole watched them from his porch where he was making tea and felt a quiet sympathy for them. It was not every day that the ruler of a third of the known galaxy's eastern star system sat at a plain wooden table on a frontier farming world, and it was clear that nobody in the colonial office had a procedure for this situation. Verithan looked at the 3 representatives when they approached. She did not say anything. She simply looked at them with the calm, patient expression of someone who had been dealing with nervous officials for a very long time. They introduced themselves in voices that were slightly too high and slightly too fast and then ran out of things to say almost immediately. She told them politely that she was not here on political business and that they were welcome to return to their offices. She would contact the colonial government directly if anything official was required. They left faster than they had arrived. Cole brought the tea out and set a cup in front of her. She looked at it with genuine curiosity. He explained what it was. She picked it up carefully in a grip that had to adjust itself significantly for the size of the cup and took a small careful sip. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was interesting. Cole sat down across from her at his plain wooden table with the chipped edge and the burn mark from an old lamp and thought about how strange a thing life was sometimes. Ember, Soot, and Flicker were in the field just outside. Not running or playing exactly but moving around each other in a loose easy way that was different from how they had moved before. Lighter. Like something they had been carrying for a long time had been set down. Cole watched them through the window while he drank his tea and felt glad for them in a simple uncomplicated way. Verithan watched him watching them. She asked him directly, "Why did you never report them?" Cole thought about the honest answer for a moment. He said he had thought about it on the first night. He said the procedure was clear and he had known the procedure. He had just looked at them and decided the procedure could wait. She asked what made him decide that. He said they were small and cold and hungry and there was nothing complicated about what they needed. He said that when something small and cold and hungry is in front of you the paperwork can wait. Verithan was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that Cole could tell she actually wanted to ask. She asked if he had known who they were. At any point. Whether he had suspected. Cole told her about the archive search. The crest. The crash screen. The single word restricted. He told her he had known something significant was connected to them but that he had not known what and had decided it did not change anything in terms of what they needed from him on a daily basis. She looked at him steadily. She said, "So you knew they were important and it made no difference to how you treated them." Cole said that was about right. She was quiet again for longer this time. Outside, Flicker found something interesting near the base of the fence post and Ember came over immediately to investigate and Soot watched both of them with the expression Cole had come to think of as senior sibling supervision. Then Verithan said she wanted to offer him something. Cole said that was not necessary. She said she understood that he felt it was not necessary. She said it was necessary to her. She said there was a difference between a debt that the other person dismissed and a debt that was actually settled and this one was nowhere near settled. Cole wrapped both hands around his teacup and waited. She began to list what she could offer him. She said it in a plain straightforward way without ceremony or exaggeration, the way someone states facts that are simply true. She could give him a ship. A proper one. Not a frontier transport but something built for deep space travel that would take him anywhere in the known galaxy. She could give him wealth enough that he and any children he might have and any children they might have would never need to work a difficult day in their lives. She could give him a title within the Virith Imperium, a formal recognized status that would open doors on every world in her territory and most worlds outside it. She could give him a home in the Imperial core worlds where the air was clean and the sky was full of stars and nothing ever broke down and stayed broken for 3 seasons because the parts were too expensive to order. She said all of this looking directly at him in a way that made clear she was not performing generosity. She meant every word of it and could deliver every word of it before the end of the week. Cole listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the field. He looked at the crystal trees at the edge of the property with their soft blue glow just beginning to show as the afternoon moved toward evening. He thought about the colony. He thought about the market on Wednesdays and the way the settlers nodded to each other in the way of people who had been through difficult seasons together. He thought about last winter. He told her there was one thing. She waited. He said the colony had been fighting a crop disease for 2 years. A slow-spreading thing that affected the root systems of the main grain varieties and had been cutting harvests down by almost a third each season. The Colonial Agricultural Office had identified the type of disease but did not have the specialist knowledge to treat it properly. They had submitted requests for assistance to the Galactic Union Agricultural Support Program 18 months ago and had not received a response. Last winter 3 children in the settlement had gotten sick. Not from the disease itself but from the food shortage that came downstream from 2 years of reduced harvests. Families that had been managing carefully had stopped managing and children had gone without enough to eat and 3 of them had needed medical care that the colony's small clinic had barely been equipped to provide. He said he was not asking for himself. He said the colony had good people in it who worked hard and had been dealt a difficult hand for a couple of years and what they needed was a proper medical team and someone who actually knew how to treat the crop disease. He stopped talking. The kitchen was very quiet. Verithan stared at him. She stared at him for a long time with an expression that Cole could not immediately read. He wondered for a moment if he had said something wrong. If the request was somehow inappropriate or too small or too large or aimed in the wrong direction. Then she laughed. It came from deep in her chest and it was enormous. The windows did not just rattle, they shook in their frames hard enough that Cole instinctively checked the nearest one to make sure it would hold. The cups on the shelf above the stove clinked against each other. Outside Ember and Flicker both looked up at the house with alert expressions and Soot stood up straight. The laugh lasted a full several seconds. When it settled she shook her head slowly and looked at Cole with an expression that was warm in a way her face had not been before. Not soft exactly. Just genuinely and completely warm. She said, "A medical team. You could have had a fleet." Cole said he did not need a fleet. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said it would be done. Not a standard medical team. A full virus specialist unit with equipment that the Galactic Union's agricultural program would not have sent in 10 years of waiting. She said the crop disease would be identified and treated before the next planting season. She said the children who had been sick last winter would be checked again. Cole nodded and said thank you. Verithan shook her head slightly like she was still processing something. Then she stood because it was time to go and the children needed to come back to the ship. The goodbyes were quiet and took longer than Cole expected. Flicker headbutt him once in the chest with enough force that Cole stepped back half a pace and then stood there absorbing it with both hands resting on Flicker's head for a moment. Soot went to the porch and came back with a careful pile of frost drops placed precisely at Cole's feet and then stood back with great dignity. Ember stood in front of Cole and looked at him for a long time. Then Ember raised one small claw very slowly and waved. Exactly the way she had watched Cole wave to his neighbors across the fence line for months. Cole raised his hand and waved back. He held himself together until the shuttle was back in the sky and the sound of it had faded into the high clouds. Then he sat down on the porch steps and looked at the pile of frost drops Soot had left in the empty field and the crystal trees going blue in the evening light. He sat there for a good while before he went inside and washed the teacups. The Virith medical team arrived 11 days after the shuttle left Cole's field. They came in a ship that was smaller than the warship but still larger than anything that had ever landed on Veritas 9 before. There were 14 of them. Specialists in agricultural biology and colony medicine and 3 others whose exact field Cole did not fully understand but who clearly knew what they were doing. They set up equipment in the colony's main square that the settlers gathered around and stared at with wide eyes and many questions. Cole watched from the edge of the crowd and did not say anything about where they had come from or why they were there. The colonial government issued a statement saying that a Virith medical and agricultural team had arrived in response to a long-standing request submitted through interstellar support channels. This was not entirely true but it was not entirely false either and Cole appreciated the discretion. The crop disease took 9 days to treat. Not 2 years of slow decline and failed harvests. 9 days of the specialist team moving through the fields with equipment that scanned the root systems at a depth the colony's own tools could not reach and applied a treatment that worked from the soil level upward. Cole watched them work his own fields on the 3rd day and felt something strange standing there. A loosening of a tension he had carried so long he had stopped noticing it was there. The 3 children who had been sick the previous winter were examined at the colony clinic with equipment that the clinic's doctor stood beside with an expression of quiet amazement. All 3 were cleared. One of them had a secondary issue that had been missed by the colony's limited diagnostic tools. It was caught and treated before it became anything serious. Cole heard about that specific detail from his neighbor Peg, who told him at the Wednesday market with tears in her eyes because the child in question was her youngest. Cole nodded and said he was very glad and bought his usual supplies and went home. He did not tell Peg where the medical team had come from. He did not tell anyone. It was not his story to announce, and he did not want the attention that would come with announcing it. Life settled back into its ordinary shape. The medical team left after 3 weeks. The trade routes were the next thing. 2 new commercial lines that had previously bypassed Veritas 9 entirely were rerouted through the system within the following month. Nobody from the shipping companies gave a clear reason for the change. The colony's traders did not ask too many questions. New routes meant new business, and new business meant the settlement could breathe a little easier, and that was enough. The colonial government was quietly aware that something significant had shifted in Veritas 9's standing in the wider galaxy. They were not sure exactly what had happened or why, but they were careful and grateful and did not push for explanations that might not come. Cole went back to farming. He repaired the section of fence on the north side that had needed attention for 2 seasons. He upgraded his grain storage unit with the improved harvest he was now able to bring in. He went to the Wednesday market. He ate plain meals at his plain wooden table. He watched the twin moons rise over the crystal forest from his porch in the evenings. The barn light stayed on every night. He told himself it was just habit. He had told himself this before. Months passed. The planting season came and went and came again. The colony had its best harvest in 4 years. Children who had been thin the previous winter were running in the settlement square with the boundless energy of young things that had been properly fed for long enough that their bodies had caught up with what they were supposed to be. Cole noticed these things on his Wednesday market trips and felt a quiet satisfaction that had no particular shape to it. Just a steady warmth sitting somewhere in his chest that had not been there 2 years ago. He did not talk about it. He just carried it. It was on an evening in the early part of the new season when the crystal trees had started their first growth of the year, and the air had that particular smell that meant the cold was finally backing off and warmth was returning to the soil. Cole had finished his dinner and washed up and was standing on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the blue light of the trees deepen as the sun went down. He heard a sound near the barn. He went still. It was a familiar sound. The specific sound of claws on the dirt path that ran along the backside of the barn. A particular pattern of weight and movement that he had not heard in months but recognized immediately and completely, the way you recognize the voice of someone important even after a long time of not hearing it. Cole set his teacup down on the porch railing. He walked around the side of the barn slowly. They were standing in the field. All 3 of them. He stopped and looked at them, and they looked at him, and for a moment nobody moved. They were bigger. Significantly bigger than the last time he had seen them. Empress stood nearly to Cole's shoulder now, where before she had barely reached his knee. Soot was broader across the back, and the silver quality in those ash-gray scales had deepened into something genuinely beautiful. Flicker had grown the most dramatically. The pale gold had spread from the scale tips all the way through now, and in the evening light Flicker almost seemed to generate a warmth of color that had nothing to do with the fading sun. Their eyes were bright and clear and completely healthy. They were not thin. They were not shaking. They were not hiding against any wall with the desperate flatness of something too weak to run. They were standing in the open field in the early evening light, looking at Cole with expressions he had learned to read over many months of careful attention. They had not come because they were hungry. Cole understood this immediately. There was no desperation in how they stood. No hollow look. No dull edges on their scales. They had come from wherever they had been, from a flagship warship somewhere in the stars, from the Imperial Core worlds, from a life that was warm and fed and safe. And they had come back here. To this field. To this barn. To him. Flicker moved first. Walked forward in that brave direct way and stopped right in front of Cole and looked up at him with those bright eyes, and then did the headbutt. Harder than before because Flicker was considerably larger than before. Cole took 2 full steps back and laughed and put both hands on either side of Flicker's head the same way he always had. Soot walked forward with full dignity and sat down at Cole's feet and looked out at the field beside him as if they were simply resuming an evening that had been briefly interrupted. Cole looked down at Soot and felt the particular warmth that Soot's quiet company had always given him. Ember stood in front of him and looked at him for a long moment. Then raised one claw and waved. Cole raised his hand and waved back. Then he noticed something at the tree line. The crystal forest at the edge of his property was fully lit now with its evening blue glow, and the light reached a good distance into the field. But just at the edge of where the light gave way to shadow, at the place where the trees began and the field ended, there was a stillness that was different from the ordinary stillness of trees. A shape. Large and dark and completely motionless. Verithan. Not in armor. Or perhaps in lighter armor, it was difficult to tell in the shadow of the trees. But standing at the tree line with a stillness that said she had been there for a little while already and was in no hurry and had not come to be noticed unless he happened to look. She was not here as an empress tonight. Cole understood that without needing to be told. She was here because 3 children had asked to come back to a place and she had brought them the way a mother brings children somewhere they have asked to go, and she had stayed at the edge out of the way because this particular thing was between her children and the man who had fed them. Cole looked at her for a moment. She did not move. He looked at ember and soot and flicker. He looked at the barn. He looked at the house with its lit kitchen window and the plain wooden table inside and the stove that was cold because dinner was long finished. He turned around and went inside. He got the large pot out from the back of the cabinet, the one he never used for just himself because it was too big for one person's meals. He put it on the stove. He went to the storage and looked at what he had and started pulling things out and thinking about quantities that would work for more than one. The barn light was already on. Was always on. Outside in the field the 3 children settled into the familiar ease of a place they knew well and a place that knew them. And at the tree line the large dark silhouette stayed still and quiet and watchful in the way of someone who was simply glad to be somewhere safe. Cole cooked extra. He had always cooked extra. He set the table and put the big pot on and went to the door and left it open the way you leave a door open when you are expecting people you are glad to have coming. The twin moons rose over Veridis 9. The crystal trees glowed blue. And a quiet farmer who had never wanted recognition or reward or a place in any story stood in his kitchen and cooked a meal large enough for everyone. Because that was who he was. And that had always been enough. He had not saved them with weapons or technology or grand speeches. He had saved them with an extra pot on the stove and a barn light left on and a willingness to sit quietly in the cold for as long as it took. Some people move through the galaxy seeking power or glory or a name that echoes across star systems. Cole Marsh just fed whoever was hungry. And somewhere in the stars an Empress remembered that the best people were often found in the quietest places doing the simplest things. And she made sure the galaxy was always a little kinder to that small glowing planet with the crystal trees. Because some things deserved to be protected. And so did the people who made them worth protecting.